In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Very nice to be with you here. We're coming towards the end on our countdown to 200 episodes of Veracity Hill. It has been so much fun to come to you week after week, bringing you new episodes. The vast majority of these episodes have been roughly an hour in length, but Chris, every now and again, I had like a 15-minute interview with Gary Habermas on the spot, something like that, or I've done talks from conferences I've been at. But, most of our programs here have been in the office. We first got started over at my house.
Yeah, upstairs
in the bedroom.
In a spare bedroom, which I think was also your library at the time.
That's right. So it's for people that have been following along since the start. It's they've seen the improvement to the show, which is what we've been looking to do is increase the quality and how it's presented.
Right.
So.
And for anyone who wants to see, all those episodes are on our YouTube page, Veracity Hill. You can subscribe.
Yes.
And you can watch all the way back to episode 1 when it's just thumbnails of Kurt.
Yes, just still images back and forth. Mm-hmm. So it's been a lot of fun to do this, and who knows what the future holds. We'll say it at that. If this is your first time tuning in, Veracity Hill is scheduled to go on an indefinite hiatus. But the ministry of Veracity Hill will continue on. So there's still work to be done, loads of content to mine from, to clip out and cut and to share with people, to encourage them to come back and listen to these interviews that we've done throughout the years. And so toward that end, if you want to consider giving us a review on iTunes, through the Google Play Store or Facebook, or becoming a financial supporter of this ongoing ministry, you can do that at veracityhill.com. And we'd love to get your reviews on those platforms as well. On today's episode, we are talking about the importance of Christian history, in some ways a tour de force, thinking about how Christians have, where they've come from, the issues they've dealt with in their societies over the centuries, the geographical spans, all sorts of topics and doctrines and politics, not just between the church and state, but from within the church. So looking at today we're looking at specifically the Zondervan Essential Companion to Christian History. And our guest today is its author, Stephen Backhouse, and he has a doctorate from the Oxford University, or Stephen, is it the University of Oxford? I always get that mixed up.
I don't know if it really matters. I say University of Oxford, but I'm not sure if there is a right way to say that, actually. You've made me think.
Good. Well, you've got multiple degrees from Oxford and McGill University, and you're the founder and director of Tent Theology, a venture that designs and delivers theology programs to local churches. Before we get going, talking about the importance of Christian history, maybe tell me a little bit about Tent Theology and what you do for that organization.
Oh, well, so I used to work, so I've been a theologian now, a professional theologian for 20 years or so in various forms. And I used to work for a couple of different theology colleges and seminaries here in the UK. And I really like theology, but I got a bit tired of just teaching people who wanted to become professional Christians. So most people in my classroom were there because they were training to become a pastor or a priest or a vicar or something. And so you ask an academic, how do we get more people into the room who aren't just wanting to become professional Christians? And academics always say, well, let's just put on another course and hopefully people will come to us. And that wasn't working because all you'd attract was people training to become pastors. So I just thought, well, I better take my show on the road. If I really believe that theology should be accessed by lots of different people and not just professional Christians, then I think I've got to take it to the churches rather than expect the churches to keep sending people to me. Mm. So, that's what I did really. And we called it Tent Theology because it's easy to set up, it's easy to take down, easy to take anywhere. And we show up at local churches or networks we live with, for at weekend or 4 days or a week sometimes, and we stay with the church, with the local worshiping community, and we open up spaces to do high-level Bible study and theology and church history. And you don't have to write essays, and you're not trying to get a degree, or you're not being told by some denomination that you must do this in order to get, the boxes checked. And it really changes the way theology works. It's a lot of fun. I love it.
All right, let me ask you, if I can maybe ask you what could be an awkward question. I'm not sure if it will be, but surely where you're at, of the Alpha course, right, which is more apologetics oriented.
Yeah.
How does yours compare to the Alpha course?
Well, Alpha course is for people who are new to Christianity or for new Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And it's deliberately designed to be a basics, whereas I'm not doing that. I mean, we're coming in and we're doing all the kind of stuff that one would do at university. Like we're doing university level engagement with the text and with the issues and the ideas, but we're doing it in an attitude or an atmosphere where people are worshiping together. They're still fellowshipping together. So it's the idea is that, theology is for anybody. We can do this.
Right. So it's not necessarily for new Christians.
Yeah. And it's funny, though, I have had new Christians. I've done tent theology gigs where there's been people coming up to me after saying, this is the first time I've ever been in a church. And their first exposure to Christianity was me doing a pretty high-level Bible study on Philippians 2 and the kenotic hymn and this kind of stuff. Huh. But they loved it. I mean, it was really fun. And halfway through the lecture, we end up having spontaneous worship. And, it's like, it's not like the kind of environments where people might associate a university lecture. And, there evangelism and fellowship and worship and learning were all happening in one room at the same time. So I don't know. I recommend it seems to be working so far. I recommend it. Yeah,
very nice. Yeah, it sounds good. And it's a great way for lay level to really get that, university level education. And who knows, maybe they will then want to go and become the pastors and get that formal.
Yeah. I mean, I find a lot of people, I get the kind of people that they just keep going on Alpha courses over and over again, and they want to do something else. I mean, Alpha course is great, but there's more to it, Christianity, than just that. And so I get those kind of people, but I also get people who are themselves, really wanting to explore it or go a bit further, and I'm their first taste. And so, we do end up sending people off to the university sometimes. So I'm not anti-university. I don't think it's a bad thing to do theology at university, but I don't think it's the only place you can do it,
Yeah, right. Okay, so you've been teaching Christian theology, Christian history, and out of that, you produce something like this, which, I'll be honest, I don't know how you condensed so many periods of Christian history down to 3 to 4 pages each.
Tell you what, man, it's only because I was an idiot and because I said I would do it before I actually did it. When you're just dumb, when people say, "Hey, do you want to do this?" I'm like, "Sure, I'll do it." And then I figure it out.
Hilarious, but I imagine. I mean, it seems like a real feat. Not writing, 200 some pages, but condensing all the material down. So someone who's studied historical theology, I can appreciate the work that you've put into this. It's taken quite a bit of effort, I imagine. And so what got you interested? Your background is in political theory, is that right? And yet here you are writing a reference book of sorts on Christian history.
Yeah, so I'm a political theologian. So I'm particularly interested in the Christians' relationship to nations and states and power and how Christians organize themselves. So also internal politics, like you mentioned in your introduction. How do we organize ourselves? What is the Christian vision for collective use of its power? How do they give it away? Who do they give it away to? All those kind of questions. How do they resolve conflict? What do Christians think about violence and money? And, all those questions that are actually very political. They might not be party political, but they are political. So I was doing, my work is particularly interested in, I use the work of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher and rabble-rouser. He was very anti-Christendom. So I did my doctorate on Kierkegaard's attack on Christendom and I found that in Kierkegaard, though, he was attacking the idea of a Christian culture or the Christianized culture. And it wasn't necessarily just the official relationship of state and church. It was more where any culture claims that Christianity is, deep in its foundation. So, I mean, America is a classic example of Christendom in a Kierkegaard sense. You might not have an established state church, but you are a clearer example of Christendom than even Kierkegaard's native Denmark was when he was writing in 1850. And anyway, Kierkegaard's sort of critique of this was, he said, the problem with growing up in a Christianized culture is that it makes it very difficult to actually become a follower of Jesus, because being born into your culture is the same as being a Christian. Whereas in the New Testament, you had to leave your culture in order to be a follower of Jesus. And now in our Christianized world, Christendom says to be a good citizen, you must be a follower of Jesus. So it's like fundamentally distorted the New Testament vision right from the start. So anyway, I was using Kierkegaard as a kind of a way to think theologically about patriotism and nationalism. And that got me thinking about, well, how did Christians relate to their states and nations at different periods of history? So you're starting to do work on like history. I began as a political theologian doing work on Kierkegaard, and I ended up doing history about how do Christians relate to their states throughout different times of historical periods. And also the rise of the state itself. I mean, this is the nation state itself has a history and a archaeology to it. And so you're just doing that kind of work. So a lot of my doctorate and postdoctorate work ended up being historical. So when I got to the point where I actually made a book proposal to the publisher, and I was going to do it on a different subject. I was going to do it more on patriotism and nationalism. And they said, we don't really want this, but we are interested in an easy to access history book. Do you want to do that? So I went, yeah. And so I backed into history. I mean, I really loved it, but I don't pretend to be a historian. I'm somebody who has found church history to be really illuminating and exciting in my own work and life. Yeah.
And I'm sure doing all the research on this and writing and composing it really helps us realize where we're at today. Sometimes there are Christians who think Christianity started 30 years ago when their church was founded.
Yeah, I agree with that. So you probably can't, your listeners can't tell because you probably think I have some weird British accent, but I'm actually Canadian. And I grew up in Bible Belt, Canada. We do have one. We have a Bible Belt. And I grew up in Western Canada, and my dad was a teacher at a little fundamentalist Bible college, self-professed. I mean, most of the people there would call themselves fundamentalists. And, I grew up in this kind of conservative evangelical world, which definitely felt like they invented Christianity. When the Bible college was founded, they kind of felt like that was the beginning of Christianity. So then to move to England, I've been in England now for 25 years, but, to move to this country and to start to see that, Christianity is a lot deeper and wider and weirder than I expected. And then to do history as well and to realize, there are so many variations. Christianity is the most diverse and multifaceted human movement in the history of human movements. Like, it's historically unique. There's no other movement that spans so many different languages and social classes and ethnicities and political ideologies. And I mean, Christianity is so big and weird. Like, it invented free market capitalism and communism, right? Like, that's how big Christianity is. Like, it invented secularism and theocracy.
Interesting.
Like, it's so deep. Like, it's spanning the kind of way that we think that our social imagination has been shaped so much by it that somebody once described it. They said, you can't taking Christianity out of history is like taking chocolate out of chocolate cake. You just can't do it. And I really did notice that, and it almost I wasn't making value judgments anymore. I'm not like, when I wrote my book, I wasn't thinking, oh, they're real Christians and they're not real Christians, or this political spectrum is not real Christianity and this one is. You can't even do that if you're going to be honest. You just have to say, oh, wow, there are a lot of people who self-identify as Christians and they diametrically opposed to each other on so many issues. And they all still call themselves Christian with legitimacy. So,
yeah, and the historical work is surely just stating the facts as they are.
yeah.
And now there's going to be some room for interpretation. I'm sure, historians dispute,
of course.
states of affairs and what happened. But nevertheless, as you said, yeah, it's very hard to separate, if not impossible, the Christian values that have influenced, changed, modified every facet of human life.
But also the opposite, right? So so it's not like there's a Christian view. Like Kierkegaard's a very good example. So the best arguments against a Christianized culture come from Christians, right? So it's kind of like Christendom has, in the name of Christ is the very best way to take down bad things being done in the name of Christ. So it's kind of like Christendom has smuggled within itself the agent of its own demise. And you see that all the time. You always see these Christian cultures in history, they set themselves up and they basically you can imagine them like building their institutions and going, right, we're settled now, we're done, we've done it. And along comes the next generation and says, wait a second, you're not acting at all like this Bible that I've got. Thank you for giving me the Bible. And now, by the way, you don't act like anything in this at all. And so every Christendom develops its own, they grow up its own generation, which then overthrows the current generation. And, that's just what Christianity is. It's constantly renewing itself every generation.
That is a very true statement. And I think, unfortunately, there are some generations which have missed out on some aspect and have been even unwilling to change. And yet, their influence at that point can only go so far because by that point, it's the younger generation that's taking over. And so, that's why it's important in many ways to reach young people while they're moldable, shapeable.
Yeah.
And otherwise, you're going to get a generation that maybe doesn't value something that they ought. And so you see that throughout Christian history. You see both the good and great and divine work of God in the course of Christian history, and unfortunately, you see the very human, unfortunate, even wicked behavior of self-described Christians throughout Christian history.
Exactly. It's everybody's wicked and evil. Like, everybody. Who's worse? Somebody who murders and is motivated by fear and greed and arrogance and pride and nationalism, or somebody who's murders motivated by fear, pride,
and calls himself a Christian
and does it in the name of Jesus? Like, who's worse? So you add on to all of that, you add blasphemy on top of that, and so if you read a history book, you meet the worst. Like, I think I have written about people in my history book that I think are some of the worst people that have ever existed, and they call themselves Christian. My moral compass is well and truly aimed at Jesus, and when it's aimed at Jesus, you're like, he was right. He said, "Not everyone who says Lord, Lord." So, I don't have to take people's self-profession of Christianity, as a guide to the truth of Christianity. I can just say, oh, no, you can call yourself a Christian and do all sorts of things. You just can't be a follower of Jesus and do lots of things. But so I'm not trying to, in my book, I wasn't trying to delineate between what I think would be an authentic Christianity. I do think there is such a thing, but it was more just to show how self-professed Christians have acted in history and what they've done and what they've built. Which itself is a really fascinating story,
So with that, maybe we can start not getting into the nitty gritty, but getting a broad stroke, a tour de force, if we could, of Christian history. And I've seen here you kind of couple categories together. You found a nice way to categorize these different centuries. And again, I want to show this, since this is sort of a reference book. I want to show this to our audience on video here. This is a great book which has 3 to 4 pages on any given century here, with images, charts, maps. It is a great textbook for lay level young students who want to learn, and it's not boring. When I took my church history class at Biola, we just had this basic book with nothing but text, and it was just so dull and dry, and I enjoyed the content. I went on to study historical theology in my doctoral studies, so I had a passion for it, but I think it could have been done so much better, and I think this is one of those ways to do it, by just making it more vibrant and bringing it to life for people. So it's really a great resource that people should check out. And we'll put a link to the book at our website. Again, Essential Companion to Christian History. So, Stephen, if we could, maybe you could give us an overview here, starting with, servants and leaders. Why that title to describe the first century church, servants and leaders?
Well, that I was trying to come up with, a way to, you try and come up with 2 words to describe a whole century, right? So I tried to do each chapter roughly 100 years of Christian history. And you realize when you're looking at the very first white hot heat of the early church, so the first 100 years, you are really looking at them, like I said, they're figuring out, how do we organize ourselves around a Jesus-shaped community? How do we do it in a Jesus-shaped way? What does it mean to lay down your life for your friends? What does it mean when Jesus said, don't be like the Gentiles who lord their power over others and dominate? What does it look like when you all of a sudden think submitting to a cross is your highlight of what it means to be glorious, right? And, how do you everyone treat everyone else with respect, or submit one to another? Like, how do you do that? What is your politics? Your small p, how do you organize yourselves in such a way that stays your guiding principle? And so you end up with this language of like servant leadership, and you get dominant personalities and the apostles and the disciples who are setting up institutions and movements, and yet they themselves are always trying to puncture their own celebrity bubbles and say, no, it's not about being the big man on campus, it's about being a servant. And so it just seemed to be almost a good way to describe how the early church was starting to organize itself and imagine what it thought it was doing when it was moving through the world. And the language of the New Testament is a lot of language of leader and servant type stuff. So I just thought that's pretty good. And then you start to see that working itself out in the earliest church as well. So the early church is starting to become popular amongst servant classes, but also amongst the, I guess we might call them in the Roman kind of middle classes, the middle administrative, small scale civic leader types. They are also becoming interested in Christianity. So even in the post New Testament early church, you're getting slaves and servants are highly identified with Christianity, but so also are, rulers and proconsuls and people who are managing a small city state and that kind of stuff. So I just saw that happening in the early church and thought servant leader was a good way to describe what's going on.
What was life like for the Christian? I mean, this is what I'm about to ask is so big and broad. We could do, just hours of discussion on this, but what was life like as an early Christian during the time of the Roman Empire?
I think the first thing that I was surprised to discover this, and yet I've now come across it from so many different sources that I know it's now true, and it doesn't feel true because it's the opposite of what you're told, in your Sunday schools or in your, typical, maybe first year undergraduate school or class or something, that we're all told that Christians were just fiercely persecuted all the time. And the idea that Christians were persecuted, and you have this idea they were huddling in a cave while Roman soldiers marched overhead. But the reality is that persecution was fierce but rare. And so the widespread persecution did not happen across the whole Roman Empire. And so what you do find, however, is that different Roman governors of different regions were given license to persecute, states' rights, I guess. Like they got it wasn't the emperor. It was the state that got to choose. It was the smaller scale state that got to choose, or the region. And so some regions had fierce persecution and other regions didn't at all, because the governor didn't care, or was maybe sort of interested in Christianity himself. And so I was very surprised to hear that. And then you start to realize that Christianity was, in some regions, quite integrated or quite well respected, or at least just abided by. And then in other areas, it was absolutely like the fiercest persecution against them. And I was surprised by that. I had assumed that everybody everywhere hated Christians, but that isn't actually true. And you do see it even in our book, in the book of Acts. You see it in the book of Revelation, where he writes a letter to the 7 churches, and those were real churches. They had a real post. You could actually ride to them, and they were all about a horse ride, a day's ride away from each other. And in one of those towns, John writes to the church in Revelation saying, like, you've held up under persecution. Well done. I've seen you, and you're holding up under persecution. And then the very next town, just a day's ride away, he says, oh, I'm looking at you, and you're lukewarm. I'm going to spit you out because you don't look any different from anyone around you. You've grown complacent. And isn't that interesting that within one day you can have one church that is being fiercely persecuted and another church that has grown complacent because nobody cares about them, and they're just looking like everybody else. So you see that actually happening in a lot of Romanized Christian culture. And then as Christians start to work their way through the system. So like I said, I think a lot of Christianity was working its way up the social scale, perhaps through women. So the women of various households. I mean, the early church met in people's homes. That's well known. But what's less acknowledged is that the homes were run by women. And that so to meet in a home meant you were in the women's domain, which is why women were seen as early leaders in the early church. And you get them being mentioned by name in lots of Paul's letters, for example. And so you realize, oh yeah, then you look at martyrdom, and you look at where the martyrs were being rounded up. You look at, well, who was chosen to be a martyr? It wasn't everybody. They would just choose the few people that looked like they were the high-profile Christians in the group, and then they'd round them up as martyrs. Well, if you look at that, then you have these lists of people who were martyrs, and they were all lots of women and lots of women slaves, which you're like, oh wow. So that's what it felt like to be a Christian in Rome. It meant that the women slaves were your most prominent members. And they were the ones that when Rome looked at you, they said, who's the most prominent person in your group? Oh, it's that woman slave. Let's get her, right? So that's interesting. And that started to work its way through the system, that Christianity had got a reputation for being a women's religion because it gave freedom and a sort of a voice and an identity to women that they didn't have anywhere else. And so you're starting to see that, and that's largely how Christianity sort of moved its way through. It got into lots of different places that way. And so, yeah.
I was gonna say, and that provided the, or was the outworking. So that was the outworking of certain teachings, Christian teachings, and then you just see that develop over time as well. For how Christianity and Christians have worked with slaves and women, and the moral progress that's been made as a result of Christian teachings.
I don't think they were trying to be moral though. Like, I don't think they were sitting in a room kind of going, gee, what's the moral philosophy that what's the theory that we should try and enact? I think it was a little bit more, they're like, well, Jesus was with these kind of people, so we should be too. and it was a little bit more shaped around, I think, just trying what we would call discipleship. It's trying to we're supposed to look like Jesus people. Who are the kind of people he was with? All right, I guess we better start being with them too. And the moral theory comes kind of later. It's like the theology comes on top after the practice. And you get people like Justin Martyr and others. So he was the first, well, as you know, he'd be the first real apologist.
Yep.
And they're writing their stuff to justify Christian practice after it's already been well established as Christian practice.
Right. Yep.
He's not writing his theory hoping people will follow it. He's writing,
Yep.
Yeah.
Hey, we've got to take a break here. When we come back, we will continue our conversation looking at Christian history and talking about its importance as well. Today I'm joined by Stephen Backhouse. He's the author of the Zondervan Essential Companion to Christian History. Be sure to stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Licona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill Podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com, and click on the sponsor tab. You can learn about the different sponsorship levels. We'd love to get your support and sponsorship for our program to continue the ministry of Veracity Hill. And again, if you have enjoyed this program week after week and you want to see the ministry continue on, please consider becoming one of our financial supporters. You can become one of our patrons, folks that just chip in a few bucks each month, $5, $10, or $20. We'd love to get your support. Well, on today's episode, we're talking about the essential companion to Christian history, the importance of studying from our history and the things we can learn from it. But before we continue our discussion on that, we have a segment on the show that we like to call...
What's Behind Kurt?
What's Behind Kurt is the name of the game. There's a green screen behind me. Presumably, Chris has been putting up the Veracity Hill banner. Maybe one of these weeks he won't. I don't know. That would throw me for a loop after
As you well
the
know.
fact, because I can't see it during the program.
It's green.
That's right. It's just green. That's all I see. The name of the game is What's Behind Kurt. I have 15 questions and 3 minutes to figure out what is behind me. So let me get the stopwatch up here on my phone. Okay. So, Chris, I am ready.
All right, there is something behind Kurt. correct.
Okay. I'm going to start the clock. You ready?
I'm ready.
Is it a person?
No.
Is it a place?
Yes.
Is it a fictional place?
No.
Is it on planet Earth?
Yes.
I need to keep doing well at my taxonomy here. Is it in the Western Hemisphere?
Yes.
Is it in the Northern Hemisphere?
Yes.
Is it in the United States?
Yes.
Whew, I was able to jump on the taxonomy on that one. Okay, I've asked how many questions?
7. You've asked 7 questions.
In 40 seconds. Okay. Is it in the eastern part of the United States? Well, let's say this. Is it east of the Mississippi River?
Yes.
Okay. Is it in Illinois?
No.
Oh, I tried to jump the gun. Oh, boy. Is it north of the Mason-Dixon line?
Where's the Mason-Dixon line again?
I think roughly Kentucky area. Somewhere, so.
Yes.
Ooh, you're not sure on your geography. Hot diggity. All right, let's see. Okay, I'm good on time.
5 questions remain.
Is it along the East Coast?
No.
Oh, boy. Wasted question. Oh, my goodness. Is it in a state that touches one of the Great Lakes?
Yes.
But remember, this could be a tricky one because before it was like New York.
Yeah, we got you on that one
I
last
know,
time.
yeah. Oh, I remember. Let's see here. Okay.
Final 3.
Just over a minute. I only have 3 questions left.
Yep.
Oh, no. I'm not going to get this. Oh, boy. Well, I've got a minute for 3 questions. So, is it a big populous city?
That's very...
I mean, is it a big metro? You know, not like... Because sometimes a town of like 5,000 people, like the city of West Chicago, it's a city technically, but that's not what I would think of.
I think the majority would consider this a large metropolitan area.
Okay, cool. Okay. But it's not in Illinois, and it's a metro area. I've got 2 questions.
Maybe a metro area.
Oh, so it's kind of mid-size. It could
I'm
go
not
either
gonna
way.
I'm not going to waste your time.
It could go either way. Oh, 10 seconds. How many questions?
2.
Is it Grand Rapids?
Nope.
Is it Cleveland, Ohio?
No.
Oh,
Cleveland.
was it like Rochester, New York?
No. The place behind you, Kurt, is Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Scranton! Oh, very nice. That is the home scene or the location of The Office.
The Office, yep.
Yep. Okay, that was a tough one. But you know what? Yes, I got stumped, but I don't feel bad about that. That was a good round. I didn't ask any poor questions, really. Yeah, that was good. All right, well,
pretty good for 15 questions.
we've got, 2 segments left of What's Behind Kurt?
I believe so.
And hopefully I'll win one of them. All right, well, let's jump back to our guest, who's probably anxiously awaiting. Our guest today is Stephen Backhouse. He's the director of Tent Theology, and we're talking about Christian history and the things we can learn from it. And right before we left off there, Stephen, I guess we could do rapid questions. Sorry, before I jump back there. Stephen, there's a segment on the show I didn't tell you about, did I?
Hit me.
It's called Rapid Questions, and it's 60 seconds. These are fun questions. We get to learn a little bit more about you, totally unrelated to our conversation today. So if you're ready, I'll start the game clock.
Okay.
Okay. What is your clothing store of choice?
I like Vans shoes.
This is a fun one. Have you ever driven on the other side of the road?
Of course I have.
You a morning person or night owl?
When I get up in the morning early, I love it, but I rarely can.
What's your favorite card game?
Gosh. I am a games guy. I love games. your readers might not like this. I don't know. Your listeners might not like this. I like really complicated, nerdy board games.
Such as?
I've got a Game of Thrones card game that I really like.
Oh,
Is Game of Thrones acceptable on this podcast?
Perhaps, yes. What's your favorite superhero?
Spider-Man, all the way.
Where would you like to live?
What a question to ask right now when I'm stuck at my own home. Where would I like to live? You know, one of my favorite places in the world is British Columbia, a little cabin near a lake in British Columbia.
Okay, very nice. Now, time's run out, but I've got some follow-ups for you here. Okay, so you're originally from Canada.
Yeah.
So were you in British Columbia? Were you raised in British Columbia, or which?
Well, I was born in Vancouver, but I didn't in British Columbia. But I grew up in Alberta, which is the province just in. So if anybody's watched Cool Runnings or heard of Eddie the Eagle, that was me. I grew up in that place during the Winter Olympics there.
Very nice. Good. And so now this is going to be a fun follow-up question. You've driven on the other side of the road. From your current perspective, being there in the UK for 20 or 25 years now, which side is the other side?
I couldn't even tell you that question. That is one of those funny, weird ones when I honestly don't know anymore. So like, whatever country I'm in, I just have to take a few seconds and look what other people are doing. And you always just think the steering wheel has to be towards the middle of the road. That's my rule of thumb.
Yeah.
So
that's fun.
Even today, I have to think, all right, the steering wheel towards the middle of the road. And then I don't even think about left hand or right hand side because it just confuses me.
And last follow up here, and I only ask it because last week our guest, if I recall correctly, Peter Gurry, also said Spider-Man was his favorite superhero. So that stuck out to me. So why is Spider-Man your favorite superhero?
It was probably the toys. I mean, I'm probably just a child of materialism, just as anybody else. And it was probably, I think I had a little Spider-Man toy, which was my favorite. And I think I got interested in the cartoons and the comics as a result of the toy.
Mm-hmm.
But he's a well-written guy. I actually enjoy reading them. There's an author named Brian Michael Bendis who he was the guy behind a lot of the Spider-Man movies. He was kind of responsible for some of the storylines. And he's a good writer. I like Bendis. So he doesn't write for Spider-Man anymore, but I used to really enjoy reading Bendis. So even as an adult, I was a Spider-Man fan.
Very nice. Good. Okay, well, for those that are tracking along, we're talking about Christian history on the program today, and we've only gotten through like the first, 300 years. So we've got to speed up at our pace at which we're flying through Christian history. But if you could, Stephen, guide us through here where the church goes once it becomes the official religion. I mean, before it becomes the official religion, Constantine calls for the tolerance of Christianity. So it becomes safe.
Him made it official. I mean, it was his son that made it official. You had to sign. The Nicene Creed became law. You had to sign up to that, which is an interesting position to be in.
Yeah. Fascinating relationship between, a Christian and state. Yeah.
Well, yeah, this is what you see, really. It's almost without exception. Like, who cares about what spectrum they fall on the political scale? Without exception, you name a state or a country, they have tried to control the narrative of Christianity for its own ends. That just always happens. And that's one of the themes that comes out.
Mm-hmm.
You always see the governments or the kind of national ruling clan or group always tries to co-opt Christianity, and then you always see Christians self-identifying really closely with that national group. So you see that a kind of the nationalism. So the nation will sort of absorb Christianity and use it for its own ends, and then the citizens will self-identify with that nation as a Christian nation, and that happens all the time. That's happened right from the start. So yeah, that's one of the themes that one sees, and then you always see the emerging group coming out of that. So then you'll always see a group that says, "Wait a second, being a Christian isn't the same as being just a pliant citizen or a patriotic member of the whatever the group is that we're born into. Maybe there's more to it than that, And then those groups always get demonized, and then they themselves sometimes end up in charge, and then they start ruling everything, and then all the cycle starts all over again.
Yeah, right. Okay, so So when we're thinking about the growth of Christianity, and you certainly see it in the conjunction between the church and state in the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire only lasts so long, and what happens then? I mean, what do we see in Christian history develop?
Well, you're starting to see that things kind of move to the edges. So what for the Romans was considered on the margins. So you got the UK, you get Britain, Ireland, Scotland. So you get Russia, China. You get some of these things that from the Roman point of view were kind of at the edge of civilization. And they're just seen as the edges. And then you start to see that the centers of power start moving towards the edges. And so the Christian church itself then starts adopting a flavor that isn't necessarily Roman anymore. So the missionaries go off to Ireland or something. They're Roman missionaries, but they end up establishing a Christianity that in Ireland that's basically native Christianity. And then that becomes the center of Christian power and thought. And likewise, Russia becomes just this hugely important Christian culture. And originally that came from, Roman or Byzantine missionaries going off to the Russian savages. And now Russia becomes the center of Christian civilization. And, you see similar things happen in China as well. There's been Christianity. One of the oldest Chinese monuments, is a Christian monument. And so Christianity is so old in China that it's a native religion. And it could be considered a native religion. And there's been Christians in China for absolutely centuries. I can't even remember they don't know exactly when Christianity first showed up. But one of the stories of China's Christianity is that missionaries come to China thinking they're bringing the gospel for the first time. And the Chinese go, oh yeah, we've heard that. And they pull out a Bible or they tell a story about a priest that came to visit them or something. And you just realize there's been Christianity in China for a long time. And that's those edges that becomes a center, Yeah.
Interesting. I hadn't known that about China. I guess I'd never considered at what point Christianity came over to the East. I know there's sort of been a tradition about Thomas going to India.
Yeah, there is, yeah.
But I don't know how well-grounded that tradition is,
Well, there's a lot of this stuff, actually. Like, almost all of these stories, you always have to put an asterisk next to it saying, well, this is legend, and you can't prove it, but this is the story.
Yep. Kind of like how St. Patrick drove out the snakes from Ireland.
There's a lot of these stories that, they're even if they're not true, they should be,
Yep. Now, as a Protestant, I am interested in the Reformation, and sometimes we think there's just this gap in Christian history. You go from the end of St. Augustine, and you skip 1,000 years forward.
I know.
But really, what
then you get Martin Luther in the Diet of Worms, and the Christianity got invented.
That's right. Yeah. So while you've talked about sort of the movement eastward, what you see in the West are, and correct me if I'm wrong, are the early developments of what would become Reformation era Roman Catholicism. So you begin to see the power of the priests develop and the bishops develop. And by power, I don't just mean church authority here. I mean like authority to tax people.
Well, exactly. They had the armies. Yeah.
That's right.
Had a standing army. Yeah. For sure.
So you see that in the early portion of the second millennium, and you see indulgences as well. What are some? Sometimes this period's called the Dark Ages, but sometimes it wasn't all dark. I mean, there were good things that came out of it, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah, of course. I mean, there was. Why do they call it the Dark Ages? I mean, there was a period of very bad popes. Like that's.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one of the things that you notice is that so when you're doing history, you're basically stuck with looking at only the people that the culture thought their story was worth recording, right? So you basically end up having to tell the story of lots of dead white men. That's basically what it comes down to. When you're telling the story of Christianity, it's absolutely chock full of dead white men. Now, I have a lot of time for a lot of those dead white men. You know, I really respect them, and they are not the full story of Christianity, right? Like, it's just that theirs is the only names and words that somebody bothered to write down, and you get the impression that Christianity is all about people like popes meeting in conclaves or kings writing edicts, and you know, you get the impression that it's all about institutions clashing with each other. But one of the things you notice if you look at like the Dark Ages or the period where the popes were pretty bad. I mean, there was a long time when the popes were awful. I mean, killing each other, complete nepotism. Just there's like the mafia, like, you know,
sexual promiscuity.
Oh, just the worst. And they weren't there because they were like called by God. They were there because, you know, the rich Italian family was sending their youngest sons off, you know, buying a papal residency for their youngest son and installing him up as the Pope and stuff. Like, there wasn't any sort of Christian vision at the heart of the place. So then you have to think, well, is this the story of Christianity for these 200 years? Well, no, of course not. So then you have to look, well, it's harder, but you have to look, well, where were people actually trying to live like Jesus? What was actually it looking like in the world? And so you get away from, it might be Dark Ages because the official representation of Christianity were bad, but it wasn't that the light of Christ was extinguished. It just wasn't being held up by important people. And so then you find, like, this is where you find really interesting stuff about like Germany being Christianized and these really brave missionaries and women coming to the Saxon tribes and converting and helping Saxon women, you know, in their childbirth. And then because women are being saved through their childbirth, they are coming to Christ. And you get these kind of stories. And they're not like famous, important people swaggering across the world stage, but they are just getting on with the job. So you have to look a bit harder, but I tried to do that in my book as well. It's hard because you do end up just having to use the names that you've been given. But if you hunt a bit further, you do find Christian history happening. It's not all dark.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder too that for us common folk, I know especially for young people, they want to be the next, you know, American Idol or the next TikTok sensation. And there's nothing wrong with just living a good life.
Well, and this is the real story of Christianity is millions of anonymous people living really faithfully and loving their neighbors. That's the actual story. It's just impossible to tell. We can't tell it. So all we can tell is the story of you know, a handful of dead important people.
Yeah.
But the real story of Christianity is there's more living people today there's more alive people today calling themselves Christians than there has been in all of history combined, you know, including like every Christian who's died. If you added them all up, they still won't equal the amount of living people today who call themselves Christians. So, you know, it's a living faith.
Yeah, living, growing, and active. And just maybe a month or so ago, we had an episode on the growth of Christianity in the global South. Which is, a new development because people think Christianity, Western civilization, not much longer, if at all, even at this point. I mean, if you're just comparing present day, the center of Christianity has shifted.
Exactly, and I don't mind. So you're so fine. I'm a North American Christian, grew up amongst evangelicals and all that, but I don't, because I'm a historian and I'm also a Christian first before I'm a Canadian or an evangelical or anything like that. I don't look at that with horror and fear. I'm like, oh, well, that's just what happens. The centers of power become corrupt. Let's be honest. They just kind of collapse under their own weight, and then the new generation bubbles up and from somewhere else, and new good things happen somewhere else. Okay, I can live with that.
Yeah.
And what you do find is when the groups of the people who once had the power just fight tooth and nail to cling and hold on to it and keep their institutions lurching forward into history. Well, that's when it just gets poisonous and horrible. I mean, that's the Dark Ages. So, I don't want to be on that side. I don't really have an iron in that fire. I'm not trying to keep one particular institution going.
Yep.
And just because it served a good, you notice this when you do church history, is you like, oh yeah, there's a lot of institutions that, started really well, and then maybe 150 years later or something, they've lost their purpose and they've become corrupt. But maybe that just means institutions shouldn't last longer than 150 years. Maybe that's the lesson we should learn. So I noticed that a lot about this kind of constant renewing of itself in Christian history, and it sort of makes you not so fearful when you see the current state collapse in certain ways, because it doesn't mean the collapse of all Christians everywhere. It just means the collapse of one expression in one, local area of the world. That's okay.
Yeah. And of course this has, this understanding, which I think is fair, has implications for example, I think how Americans should vote. I mean, some people, they want to preserve a culture, a way of life, which in some ways is good and beneficial, but as I've said before, culture warring for the sake of culture warring is no good. I mean, if you're culture warring for the sake of making disciples, or making disciples and the effects of that lead to disagreements on how the culture should, what policy should be in place, et cetera, we should recognize that, hey, some battles aren't worth fighting. We've got more important things to do. And even what's going on down over there in some other country is okay, so yeah. Yeah,
it's interesting. We got to, you got to pay attention to the global South and to Africa as well, and you got to, even if you don't call yourself a Pentecostal, you got to pay attention with honesty and think, wow, Pentecostalism is right now the most successful and widespread version of Christianity we've ever known, and we got to pay attention to that and treat it with intellectual and spiritual humility and honesty, even if you aren't a Pentecostal. And and Africa and China and the global South, these are the countries where some very powerful expressions of Christianity are coming up, and they're having almost no contact at all with the kind of Anglo-Saxon visions of Protestantism.
Yeah.
Yep. They're not taking their cultural cues from Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so you got to pay attention to them,
Yep.
and not just condemn them all the time because they're different. It's like, well, that's all right. Anglo-Saxon Protestants were the crazy outsiders once upon a time too.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, we've only been able to cover but a few areas of Christian history here. There's so much to check out and read. Let me ask you this last question for you, Stephen. When you were doing your research for this project, what maybe was most surprising to you that you discovered? What went against maybe your intuitions or even what you had been taught?
I'm thinking, when you asked that question, my first thought went to the Ethiopian church and just how deep Christianity is in Ethiopia, and they get to trace their Christianity back to the Ethiopian eunuch mentioned in Acts, and just how interesting it is to see an Ethiopian Christianity they were never colonized by Europe. They didn't have the same kind of conflicts with the Byzantine church or the Catholic church. So I was really interested to see like a really ancient native African Christianity was an interesting thing to look at. So I'd recommend people check that out if they're interested in that. And also the Palestinian Christians as well. Like, there's been Christians in the Middle East, just since before they were called Christians.
Yep. And
again, their Christian culture is deep and rich and totally ignored by the West. Because they think Christians have moved on and they don't think of Middle East as a Christian nation anymore. But there's Arabic Christian speakers that have been, and Arabic has been a Christian language since before they were called Christians, and that's really worth paying attention to. Yeah.
Very nice. And what's on your writing docket these days? Someone like yourself is surely always churning out something from time to time.
Well, at the moment, I've been working on a series of podcasts, and I've been working through a political theology Bible study on the Gospel of Mark, and I've been running people through that, which actually you can download for free on tenttheology.com, and I might turn that into a book one day. And also, I'm trying to work on something to do with nationalism and the theology of nationalism and patriotism and theological assessment of those ideologies. But that will again be in the future, and I probably will try and talk through my ideas on a podcast before I write them down.
Sure, yeah. That way they're just in audio recording on the internet, not in print.
And then maybe the print can come later. I don't know. I'm just toying with different ideas of how to work out my thoughts,
Very nice. Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us on our program today. And we'll be sure to put a link to the book, Zondervan Essential Companion to Christian History, an Evangelical Christian Publisher Association's finalist for Reference Book of the Year. So congrats on that as well.
Well, thank you for giving me the time to chat church history with you. I'm glad I got in before Veracity Hill moves on to other things.
Yes, to the best of our knowledge, it's kind of still up in the air sort of thing. But thank you.
Sounds exciting. You got good stuff coming. Always bubbling things, new things always bubbling up. That's always the way to go.
Yes, thank you. Good. Well, that does it for the show today. We've got just 2 more episodes left. Exciting guests and exciting topics coming up, and very excited for those. I've been a bit quiet about the guests. I'm excited about them, so I hope you will be too when they appear the next 2 weeks. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that have just chipped in a few bucks each month, and whether it's $5, $10, or $20, we'd love to get your ongoing support for the ministry of Veracity Hill. And I'm also grateful for the partnerships that we've had with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, for all the fine work that he does week in, week out for the program. To Mark, our communications associate, who helps with announcements and scheduling guests. And I want to thank our guest today, Dr. Stephen Backhouse, for the fine work that he's done in compiling, truly a fine work and a lot of work to condense Christian history down to just 200 pages with charts, images, maps, and to make it look vibrant. It's a great work. I highly consider purchasing this book. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.